Okay, we are on episode 5, which brings us to chapter 5 in David McCullough's book, 1776. Chapter 5 and chapter 6, the last chapter of part 2 and then the first chapter of part 3, are probably the longest two chapters in the book, so these next two episodes may be the longest. As you work through chapter 5 here, I'd really encourage you to make sure that you look at slide 5 on the PowerPoint that I provided for you. It gives you a pretty decent map of New York so you can get the lay of the land of what's going on. Chapter 5 is divided into 4 parts, so let me just jump in and walk you through chapter 5. At the end of chapter 3, the British had made a decision that they were going to attack on Long Island. Washington did not believe that that was going to be the case. He thought that any attack on Long Island was going to be a feint attack. He was mistaken. You have 90 ships, British ships, that are present in New York and 15,000 men, including, as I mentioned to you, 8,000 or so of those German Hessian troops that come to play. So part 1 picks up with the fact that the British have landed on Long Island. Washington, still thinking that that was some sort of feint, only sent 1,500 men across the East River toward Brooklyn, which is on Long Island. And again, you see Washington being caught flat-footed here, as he thought that that attack was just going to be a feint. The Jamaica Pass was the key to the Battle of Long Island. And it's Henry Clinton, second in command to British General William Howe, who realized the significance of a pass on Long Island called Jamaica Pass, just a gap in the defensive lines that the Americans had left undefended. He realized that that was the key, wrote a letter to William Howe suggesting that that's when the attack needed to be launched, and of course that is what's going to happen. In part 1, McCullough inserts a description in the midst of what's going on Long Island, a description of the average British soldier. And in short, the way he described the average British soldier compared to the American is that he was better trained, cleaner, and healthier than the Americans. Usually younger countrymen, men from the countryside of Great Britain in their late 20s. On average, they were about 4 or 5 years older than their American counterpart in the American Revolution. So he gives you that little interesting snippet there on the British soldier, and then he picks right back up with the move toward Jamaica Pass. And again, the New York area had many loyalists, and 3 farmers on Long Island, American farmers, helped the British Army get to Jamaica Pass, and that's what they're going to use to flank the American Army. That ends part 1 of chapter 5. Part 2 kind of gets just right in to the midst of the battle. You have an attack that takes place on the American left, close to Brooklyn Heights or close to Brooklyn, and then the major attack is this flanking maneuver that is taking place at Jamaica Pass. The Americans are caught totally off guard. Washington arrives on the scene at 9 or 10 in the morning, and things are already falling apart. Sterling, Isaac Putnam was the overall commander of the American forces. Washington criticized some of his preparation. Sterling is in charge of one flank of the army, and he is forced to surrender by the Hessians. The Hessians brutally kill some prisoners that they captured, and the American army, this is kind of short-circuiting a lot of what the chapter describes in detail, the American army is simply rolled up from its left to its right as they are forced to retreat back into the defenses at Brooklyn, what was known as Brooklyn Heights, right on the end of Long Island on the East River. You look across the East River, and there you have Manhattan or New York itself. So the Americans are pinned in. No doubt or little doubt at this point that if Howe would have pressed the Americans at Brooklyn Heights as the American forces are reeling, that he would have defeated them. Washington himself likely could have been captured and the war could have come to an end. But Howe pulls up. He doesn't want to do that. The legacy of Bunker Hill, and just his natural tentativeness prevents that from happening. So there's no British attack on Brooklyn Heights, which proves ultimately good for the Americans. That's a summary of Part 2. Part 3 is you just continue to see George Washington reeling, not knowing what to do, where to send troops. Back and forth troops are sent from Brooklyn back to New York, back and forth across the East River. If the British again would have attacked, they could have wiped them out. If they could have moved their navy north and outflanked the American army on Manhattan or York Island, they also could have ended the war. But again, weather intervenes here. A storm sets in, and they're really unable to cut off the Americans. Washington and his commanders, they hold another one of these councils of war that I mentioned to you, and they agreed that the best thing to do was to retreat, to leave Brooklyn Heights, cross the East River back toward New York, and that's what they ultimately decided to do. Thomas Mifflin was the one who strongly suggested that and didn't want to be viewed as a coward, so he agreed to be the commander of the last troops to leave Brooklyn Heights, and in fact he was, as retreat is ordered. A guy by the name of John Glover is put in charge of the evacuation of Brooklyn. The book goes into significant detail of that evacuation from Brooklyn across the East River to New York. Pretty monumental task there as they're retreating. Things go fairly well, but they begin to run out of time. They needed to cross before the morning. They're doing this in the dead of the night, and they simply don't make it. The sun begins to rise in the morning, but again, here comes bad weather intervening for the Americans, and some have just interjected here. It's almost as if God's hand descends upon the weather here, helping out the American cause, as a deep fog descends on the Brooklyn side, but it's clear on the New York side where all these retreating American soldiers end up. And that takes care of Part 3. Part 4 of Chapter 5 really analyzes the overall New York campaign. So a couple of things just to mention about that. The British reaction to the New York campaign was mixed. Some celebration because they had forced Washington to retreat, but yet some caution there in that celebration because the war perhaps could have ended here and Washington's army has still not been captured. McCullough is pretty critical of George Washington and the way that he handled the Battle of Long Island or New York here. Just views it as a total fiasco. Bottom line, Washington should have known better than to try to fight the British with their superior naval forces here, their ability to land troops wherever they wanted to, whenever they wanted to. But yet Washington insisted on the defense of New York. He seemed to always be, again, as I mentioned, caught flat-footed, moving troops from this place to the other place. No excuse for leaving Jamaica Pass vacant like he did, unprotected. A lot of people were blamed for it, but the blame at least partly rests with the commander. Henry Knox surmised that if Nathaniel Greene would not have been sick during this campaign, that he would have known about Jamaica Pass. It wouldn't have been undefended. McCullough says, yeah, maybe the battle could have been bloody or it could have been longer, but it was a foregone conclusion that the Patriots were going to lose this battle. It was simply ill-conceived from the very beginning. But bottom line, as you come to the end of Part 2, which deals with, again, the fighting that takes place at New York, here's the way you may want to bottom line it. The British could have ended the war, but they didn't. Washington, although reeling, although having some blame here for the way he conducted this, is still alive. His army is still intact. But as anyone knows, you don't win a war by retreating, and that's what Washington is in the midst of doing. So kind of a low water mark, but survived, still there. And that's where part 2 and chapter 5 of the book end. So 2 more episodes left to go.